The auctioneer stopped in the middle of his chant and looked straight at Lena Mercer. "You know the refrigeration is dead on all six, right?" Lena kept her bidder card up. The stainless steel bulk milk tanks sat in a row behind him, dull under the gray morning light. The compressors had been stripped. 2 agitator motors were missing. One tank had a dent across the outer jacket where a tractor had backed into it. Every piece of equipment wore the same red salvage tag. No warranty, no cooling, scrap value only. The crowd had already lost interest. Lena had not. "I'm not buying refrigerators," she said. The auctioneer waited, as if there had to be a second half to that answer. There wasn't. He looked down at his sheet, shrugged, and started the chant again. 3 minutes later, Lena owned nearly 2,000 gallons of stainless tankage for less than the price of one winter's heating oil. That was the part people repeated afterward. Not because anybody understood what she planned to do with the tanks. They repeated it because, at the time, it sounded like the cleanest proof available that Lena Mercer had finally run out of good judgment. The farm was already short on money. Her father's health had cut his working day down to a few careful hours. The old farmhouse leaked heat through plaster walls and loose window sashes. The kidding room in the goat barn had one oil-fired heater that rattled like a bucket of bolts every time it lit. And the previous winter, keeping those 2 buildings barely livable, had burned through a little more than $2,600 in heating oil. That number mattered because Lena did not have $2,600 to waste again. She had come back to the Ozark Ridge country with a used pickup, a tool chest, and the remains of a severance check from a food processing plant in Fort Smith. At the plant, her title had been maintenance coordinator, which sounded like an office job until a conveyor went down on second shift, and everybody started looking for the person who knew which motor was drawing too much current, which pump had been rebuilt last, and which mechanic could make a temporary repair without turning temporary into permanent. Lena was good at that kind of work. She was not an engineer. She never claimed to be one. She had 2 semesters of community college industrial maintenance, a stack of equipment manuals she had kept because nobody else wanted them, and the habit of writing temperatures, pressures, times, and failures in a black composition notebook. More important, she knew the difference between a machine being broken and a machine no longer being useful for its original job. The 6 milk tanks at the auction could no longer chill grade A milk. Their refrigeration packages were dead, their stainless jackets were old, and no operating dairy wanted to risk production on obsolete equipment. But the inner vessels still held water. That was enough to make Lena see something nobody else at the sale was looking for. Not cooling, storage. A week before the auction, Cal Stokes from Ridge County Heating had sat at the Mercer's kitchen table with a financing folder open between them. Cal was not a bad man. That made the conversation harder, not easier. He had installed half the oil furnaces in the valley, knew every bad chimney and frozen crawl space by address, and had been the one who came out at 2 in the morning 3 winters earlier when the Mercer's burner nozzle clogged. He had also learned how to talk to people who were scared of the next fuel bill. "New furnace, new tank, 5-year note," he said. "You get reliability. You get parts I can actually find. You get to stop nursing that old boiler like it's a sick calf." The payment was manageable in the way recurring payments are always manageable when you look at them 1 month at a time. The fuel was not included. Lena tapped the estimate with one finger. "So I borrow money to buy a better way to keep buying oil." Cal leaned back. "You borrow money to buy heat." "No," Lena said. "The oil buys heat. The furnace just decides how much of it I lose." He smiled at that, but only because he thought she was being difficult. "Lena, everything that heats a house has a fuel bill somewhere." She looked through the kitchen doorway toward the barn, where 3 cords worth of sawmill slabwood lay in a crooked pile under a tarp because the pallet shop in town had paid a man to haul it away. Then she looked back at the estimate. "Maybe," she said. Cal closed the folder. "Call me before the first hard freeze." She did not call him. Instead, she went to a dairy liquidation sale and bought 6 broken milk tanks. Getting them home cost almost as much as buying them. The biggest one weighed close to 1,000 pounds empty. The loader operator set the tanks on 2 borrowed flatbed trailers, while Lena crawled around the fittings with a flashlight, checking the inside shells for obvious damage. She did not care about the refrigeration jackets. She cared about the vessels. By dark, 4 tanks were chained down behind her pickup and 2 more were waiting for a second trip. Her father, Ray Mercer, came out of the house when she brought the first load up the drive. He walked with a cane now, not because he liked it, but because a stroke the previous spring had left his right leg uncertain when he was tired. Before that, he had been the kind of man who moved hay bales by refusing to admit they were heavy. He stood beside the flatbed and looked at the dented stainless tanks. "They give you the cows with them?" "No." "Shame. At least then we'd know what they're for." Lena climbed onto the trailer and loosened a binder. "They're for heat." Ray stared at the tanks again. Then he looked at his daughter. All right, that was it. No speech, no blessing, no warning. Ray had spent 40 years on a farm. He knew better than to judge a repair before someone had finished making the mistake. The idea was simple enough that Lena distrusted it immediately. Water holds heat, a lot of it. At the processing plant, hot water demand had been constant. Washdown, sanitation, line cleaning. The plant used insulated tanks so the boilers did not have to fire every time somebody opened a valve. Heat was made hard and fast, stored, then used later. Lena had watched operators complain when a tank was 10 degrees low because 10 degrees across hundreds of gallons meant real energy. The farmhouse had the opposite problem. Its old oil system made heat only when the thermostat demanded it. Fire on, fire off, fire on again. Every cold hour had to be paid for in real time. Wood was different on the Mercer place. Wood was cheap, sometimes free, but it demanded labor. A normal stove rewarded constant attention. Feed it, feel warm. Ignore it, wait cold. Lena did not want a hotter fire. She wanted time between fires. On paper, 2,000 gallons of water gave her that time. She did the arithmetic 3 times because the answer looked too generous. Water weighs a little over 8 pounds a gallon. Raise a large tank of water by a meaningful number of degrees and the stored heat becomes substantial. Not infinite, not magic, but enough to move heat from the hours when a wood fire was burning cleanly into the hours when nobody wanted to be awake feeding it. The storage tanks would not create energy. They would only change when the energy had to be made. That distinction became the center of the whole project. Lena cleared the north end of an old block utility building 20 feet from the house. The room had once held milk cans and a cream separator. It had a concrete floor, a floor drain, and walls ugly enough that nobody cared when she drilled through them. The tanks went inside one at a time. She did not try to stack them. Full of water, each one would weigh several thousand pounds. The concrete got inspected for cracks. The tanks sat level on distributed supports. Every connection she made to storage stayed at atmospheric pressure. The sealed heating loops would exchange heat through coils and rated components, instead of turning old dairy equipment into homemade pressure vessels. That rule cost her money. It also kept the project from becoming something stupid. For the heat source, she found a used commercial wood-fired hydronic boiler at a greenhouse auction 2 counties over. The pressure vessel had passed inspection when it was removed. The greenhouse had replaced it with gas, Not because the boiler was unsafe, but because nobody wanted to pay a man to feed it before sunrise. Lena bought it for less than 1 month's oil delivery. She did not alter the vessel. She replaced failed gauges, installed new relief hardware, and kept the listed safety controls intact. Anything she did not understand went into the notebook under a heading that read, "Don't pretend." Cal Stokes came by while she was running the first lengths of copper. He stood in the doorway of the utility building and took in the milk tanks, the boiler, the temporary sawhorse workbench, and the hand-drawn piping sketch taped to the wall. "You building a brewery?" "No." "Swimming pool?" "No." He walked over to the large tank and knocked on the stainless shell. "You know stainless doesn't make heat." "I know. And water doesn't make heat." "I know that too." Cal folded his arms. "Then what am I missing?" Lena pointed to the boiler. "That makes heat when I'm awake. Those keep part of it until I'm not." Cal looked from one to the other. "A buffer tank. Several. The size of a shed. That's the idea." He let out a slow breath through his nose. "You're taking one fuel bill and turning it into a plumbing problem. Plumbing I can fix." That answer bothered him more than an argument would have. He looked at the open financing folder on the workbench. She had been using the back of his estimate to sketch pipe routes. "First hard freeze," he said again. Then he left. Lena's first complete piping loop looked better than it worked. That is an expensive category of failure because it takes longer to believe. She had the boiler on one side, storage on the other, and a circulator moving water through a heat exchanger between them. The house loop came off the storage side. 2 oversized radiators from a demolished school went into the farmhouse. Another loop ran to the kidding room, where the old oil heater remained as backup. The first firing happened on a November afternoon with the outside temperature in the low 40s. She loaded dry oak cutoffs from the pallet shop, lit from the top, and waited for the flue thermometer to climb. At first, everything behaved. The supply line warmed, the circulator came on. The first storage tank began to gain temperature. Then the fire changed. The bright flame dulled. Smoke thickened inside the firebox. The chimney, which had drawn cleanly during warm-up, started breathing a dirty gray plume. 20 minutes later, black liquid appeared at a clean-out seam. Creosote. Lena shut the burn down as carefully as she could and opened the utility building doors. The smell soaked into her hair, her coat, and the notebook lying open on the bench. Ray came out at dusk and found her with a flashlight inside the firebox. "House warm?" he asked. "No." "Barn warm?" "No." "Learn anything?" Lena sat back on her heels. "I built a very efficient chimney tar machine." Ray nodded as if that counted as progress. It did, but not the kind she had budgeted for. The problem was the return temperature. She had connected a hot fire to a huge reservoir of cold water and expected the boiler to stay happy while the storage drank everything it could take. Instead, the cold return water dragged the boiler down into a temperature range where combustion became dirty and the flue gases cooled too much. The system was stealing heat from the fire before the fire was ready to give it cleanly. Lena found the warning in the boiler's old installation manual that night. She had skimmed past it the first time because she thought it applied to somebody else's piping. Minimum return temperature. Boiler protection. Avoid sustained cold return. 3 plain ideas she had paid for by filling half a chimney with tar. She rebuilt the charging side with a short hot loop and a thermostatic mixing arrangement that kept the boiler warm before allowing it to send significant heat to storage. The fire would come up to efficient operating temperature first. Then the storage could take what the boiler had to spare. It was the first major correction, and it changed the way Lena thought about the entire system. The tanks were not a hole she could pour heat into as fast as possible. Charging had conditions. So did discharging. The machinery in between mattered. The second firing burned clean. The third burned cleaner. By Thanksgiving, she could raise the first tank well above room temperature without fouling the flue, and the house radiators would stay warm for several hours after the fire had gone out. Several hours was not enough. The problem moved. This time, it was not combustion. It was loss. The dairy tanks had been insulated for refrigeration, but they were old, dented, and never designed to sit full of hot water in an unheated block building. The outer jackets were warm to the touch. Every exposed fitting was a little chimney. The copper lines between tanks radiated heat into the utility room until the room became almost comfortable. Comfortable was bad. Nobody lived in the utility room. Lena walked the piping with an infrared thermometer borrowed from the plant mechanic who still owed her $20. She wrote down every hot valve, every bare elbow, every tank seam that felt warmer than it should. Then she spent money she did not want to spend on insulation. The tanks got wrapped and enclosed. The hottest piping disappeared under proper high-temperature insulation. The storage room door got weather-stripped. She sealed gaps where cold wind pushed through the old block wall. The next test held noticeably longer. That was when people began stopping by to look. Not because they believed in it. Because smoke was coming from the wood boiler stack only a few hours a day, while the Mercer's house radiators stayed warm long after the fire died. In a rural community, anything that looks inefficient but keeps working earns spectators. One of them was Marnie Holt, who ran the feed store and had sold Ray Mercer cracked corn, mineral blocks, gate hinges, and bad advice for 30 years. She stood in the utility room with both hands in the pockets of her canvas vest. "How much oil have you burned?" "Some." "How much is some?" "Not enough days yet to brag about." Marnie grinned. "Good. Bragging ruins more farm equipment than rust." Then she put her palm against the insulated tank shell, felt almost nothing, and frowned. "It's not hot. That's the point." Marnie looked at her. For the first time, the joke left her face. By early December, Lena had one part of the problem mostly under control. She could burn a short, hot, clean fire and move a useful amount of heat into storage. The house could coast for a while after the fire went out. The kitting room stayed above freezing without the oil heater running constantly. The system still had an electrical weakness she had not fully respected. The circulators needed power. Lena knew that in the abstract. She had wired the controls through fused disconnects and kept the boiler's safety devices intact. She had even written "power outage" across the top of one notebook page. Then she kept building anyway. The ice storm arrived after dark on January 15th. Freezing rain glazed the ridge road, the gate chain, the cedar limbs, and the power lines running over the north pasture. By 9, trees were cracking in the woods. By 10, the lights flickered 3 times. Lena had a strong fire in the boiler because the forecast had called for a hard freeze behind the ice. At 10:17, the power went out. The circulators stopped instantly. The fire did not. For a few seconds, the utility room became unnaturally quiet. Then the boiler temperature began climbing. Lena was already moving. She opened the air controls according to the shutdown procedure, then corrected herself and reduced combustion. She checked the gauges. She verified the relief path. She had done enough homework to avoid doing something reckless. But stored fuel was still burning inside a hot firebox, and without circulation, the boiler had nowhere useful to send the heat. The first relief event sounded like a hammer striking pipe. Steam and hot water discharged safely through the relief line into the floor drain, exactly where the safety hardware was designed to send it. The fact that it worked did not make Lena feel better. The second discharge filled the room with white vapor. Ray shouted from the doorway. "You need me?" Stay out. I can shut something. Nothing you can shut makes this better. Stay out. She killed the fire as far as the boiler allowed, opened the door only when conditions were safe, and waited. The system did not explode. Nobody got burned. No tank ruptured. The relief equipment did its job, and by midnight Lena knew she had still failed. A heating system built for bad winter weather could not become unsafe merely because winter weather knocked down a power line. The next morning, the inspector put the problem into fewer words. Mel Turner was the county mechanical inspector, a compact man with silver hair and a habit of reading every equipment plate before he spoke. He did not care that the tanks came from a dairy auction. He did not care that the wood was free. He cared about listed appliances, relief capacity, clearances, controls, pressure, and what happened when one system stopped depending on another. He walked the charging loop twice. Your relief path worked, he said. Yes. Good. That's why nobody got hurt. He pointed to the circulator. But this is your only active way to move heat away from a live fire. Yes. Then this pump is doing two jobs. It is moving energy, and it is standing between normal operation and a safety event. Lena looked at the pump. She hated how obvious the problem became after somebody said it cleanly. Mel wrote a correction notice. He did not ban the project. He did not laugh at it. That would have been easier to resent. He simply told her the charging side needed a passive path or another approved means of safely shedding heat when power failed. Until then, no firing. The red notice went on the disconnect. Outside, the whole ridge was iced over. Inside the house, the oil burner started. That sound hurt more than the inspector's paper. For the next 5 days, Lena burned heating oil while the wood boiler sat cold 20 feet away. The bill was not large yet. That was almost worse. Each time the burner lit, she could hear the old financial rhythm returning. A few dollars now, a few more at midnight. A delivery next week. Another after that. Nothing dramatic. Just a slow transfer of money out of the farm every time the temperature fell. Cal Stokes came by on the 3rd day because Ray had called him about a separate thermostat problem. He saw the red correction notice through the utility room window. To his credit, he did not say, "I told you so." He fixed the thermostat in 12 minutes, wrote the service charge, and sat at the kitchen table while Lena counted cash from an envelope. "The financing offer still works," he said quietly. Lena kept counting. "I know. I'm not trying to win something here. I know. You got close." That made her stop. She looked up. Close to what? Cal did not answer immediately. Close to making it useful. Lena folded the bills once and put them in his hand. Useful isn't the standard. No. Safe when everything goes wrong is the standard. Cal nodded. He put his gloves on. Then fix that part. After he left, Lena sat alone at the kitchen table with the financing folder beside her notebook. The farm account had dropped low enough that the next mistake would not be educational. It would simply be expensive. She could sell 2 of the tanks. Keep one as a buffer, install the new oil furnace, and tell herself the experiment had taught her something. That would have been true. It also would have meant that every cold night still had a meter attached to it. Ray came in from the barn slowly, leaned his cane against the table, and lowered himself into the chair across from her. "You quitting?" "Thinking. Same face you make when you quit." "I haven't quit enough things for you to know that face. You quit piano. I was 9. Still counts." She almost laughed. Ray looked toward the dark utility building. What actually went wrong? Power went out. Pump stopped. Fire didn't. Then the fire needs somewhere to go without the pump. Lena stared at him. Ray raised one shoulder. "I don't know pipes. I know gates. If cattle only have one gate and that gate jams, you don't have a gate. You have a wall." He got back up and took his cane. That was as close as Ray Mercer ever came to a design review. Lena reopened the notebook. The correction changed the system more than the first failure had. She separated safety from storage performance. The boiler would keep its powered charging loop, but it would also get an approved gravity dump zone above the appliance, sized to take heat without a circulator. Large pipe rose continuously to a bank of old cast-iron radiators mounted high in the utility building. If power died during a burn, hot water could rise on its own, cooler water could fall, and the boiler would have a passive place to shed energy. She added a normally open control path where appropriate, reworked the wiring, and had Mel review the plan before she fired anything. He made her change 2 fittings, increase one section of pipe, and move a shutoff so nobody could accidentally isolate the safety path. Then he signed the correction. That signature did not prove the thermal storage idea worked. It proved the dangerous part had been addressed properly. Lena appreciated the difference. The next major improvement had nothing to do with safety. It came from watching temperatures inside the tanks. She had been treating each vessel as if all the water inside it were one temperature. It was not. Hot water rose. Cooler water settled. If she charged from the wrong point or stirred the storage too aggressively, she destroyed that layering and turned useful hot water into a much larger volume of lukewarm water. Lukewarm water is disappointing because it contains energy that is hard to use. The house radiators did not care how many total heat units were hiding in the tanks. They cared whether the supply water was hot enough to move heat into the rooms. So Lena changed the connections. Hot charging water entered high. Cooler return water came back low. The house loop drew from the warmest available layer and returned cooler water toward the bottom. She reduced unnecessary mixing. The tanks became less like bathtubs and more like stacks of temperature. She could see the difference on 3-dial thermometers mounted at different heights. Top hot, middle warm, bottom cooler. As the house pulled heat, the useful boundary moved downward. For the first time, the storage had a readable shape. Marnie Holt came by again and found Lena standing in front of the gauges with a pencil. "You winning?" Marnie asked. "Ask me in the morning." That's farmer for no. That's farmer for ask me in the morning. Marnie leaned closer to the dials. "Which one matters?" Lena pointed at the top gauge. "That one tells me what I can use now. Bottom tells me what the next fire has to replace. And the middle tells me whether I ruin the other two by mixing everything together." Marnie considered that. "So you've got a tank full of yesterday?" Lena looked at her. "Something like that." It was the only metaphor she kept. By the end of that winter, the system was not finished, but it had crossed an important line. Lena no longer asked whether heat storage worked. She asked how long this particular storage could carry this particular farm under specific weather. That was a much better question. She began logging every useful variable she could manage without turning the farm into a laboratory. Outside temperature, wood load by rough weight, boiler supply and return, tank top, middle, and bottom. House temperature, kitting room temperature, time the fire was lit, time it went to coals, time the next fire became necessary. Her notebook filled with ugly pages. Some burns were clean but too small. Some were large enough to overcharge the first tank, while the other vessels sat underused because her transfer piping was too restrictive. 1 week of windy weather exposed a draft around the farmhouse attic hatch that stole more heat than any tank improvement could recover. That discovery irritated Lena so much she fixed the hatch the same afternoon. It also forced her to admit something she had resisted. Storage did not excuse a bad building. If the house leaked heat faster than the tanks could deliver it, adding more storage only meant working harder to feed a leak. She weather-stripped doors. She repaired broken storm windows. She added insulation where she could reach it. She sealed the top of the stairwell and insulated the pipe run to the barn. None of that looked inventive. All of it worked. The project became less interesting to spectators as it became more successful. There is not much entertainment in watching a woman caulk a window. Lena preferred it that way. The real test came the following January. The forecast called for a clear, hard, cold front after sunset. By late afternoon, the temperature was already dropping through the 20s. The wind had swung north. Ice left from an earlier storm shone in the shaded ditches. The goat barn was full. 4 does were close to kidding. Ray had set extra straw in the pens and then been ordered back to the house before he could pretend he was not tired. Lena started the boiler before dusk. This time, she did not load it as if more fire meant more success. She followed the system she had learned. Let the boiler come up hot. Protect the return. Charge the upper storage first. Bring the second bank in as temperature climbed. Watch the flue. Watch the top gauge. Stop adding fuel before the tanks reached a temperature she did not need. The fire burned bright and clean for several hours. By 10 that night, the last useful flame was gone. Lena closed the loading door, checked the gauges, and wrote down the numbers. The top of the first storage bank was in the mid-150s. The lower section remained cooler. The house sat near 70. The kidding room was in the upper 40s. Warm enough for the animals without pretending the barn was a living room. Outside, the temperature had fallen into the teens. Lena went to bed. At 1:30, a goat woke her. Not the thermostat, a goat. She pulled on coveralls and boots and went to the barn with a flashlight. One of the does had delivered the first kid cleanly and was working on the second. The kidding room was still warm enough that Lena could take off her gloves while she cleared the newborn's nose. The oil heater was silent. The wood boiler was dark. Heat was still coming through the wall radiator from water-warmed hours earlier. Lena did not celebrate. She dried the kid, checked the dough, and wrote the barn temperature on the back of a feed receipt because her notebook was in the house. At 5:45, she checked again. Outside, it was around 10 degrees. The farmhouse was 68. The kidding room was 46. The top of the first storage bank had fallen, but it was still warm enough to serve the loops. The middle gauge had moved down more slowly. The bottom stayed comparatively cool. The layering was intact. The fire had been out for most of the night. The oil burner had not started once. Ray came into the kitchen after 6, wearing a sweater over his undershirt and looking suspiciously at the radiator. "You fire already?" "Not yet." He put his hand on the radiator. "Still warm." "Yep." "How cold?" 10, maybe 11. He looked toward the utility building. "How long since the fire?" "About 8 hours." Ray stood there with his hand on the radiator for another few seconds. Then he took it away and reached for the coffee pot. "Kid born?" 2. "Good." That was the morning Lena stopped needing the system to impress anybody. It had done the job she built it to do. Not perfectly, not forever, not for free. The pump still used electricity. The boiler still needed cleaning. Somebody still had to cut, move, and load wood. The tanks occupied most of a utility room. The system made no sense for a person who wanted to turn a thermostat and forget the machinery existed. And if Lena left the farm for several winter days, the oil backup still mattered. But the basic bargain had changed. Before, cold weather forced the Mercers to buy heat on the weather's schedule. Now Lena could make most of their heat during a few deliberate burns using waste wood that nearby mills and pallet shops were happy to get rid of, store much of that heat in water, and spend it gradually. The first winter after the redesign, the oil truck still came. It came far less often. Lena kept every delivery ticket. She did not announce the savings at the feed store. She did not write them on a sign. She did not tell Cal Stokes that he had been wrong because, in the part that mattered, he had not been entirely wrong. A new oil furnace would have been simpler. It also would have kept the farm dependent on fuel deliveries the Mercers could not control. Lena had chosen complexity she could service over simplicity she could only keep purchasing. That trade-off was the honest version of the story. The next lesson came from the fuel itself. Lena had spent so much time thinking about tanks, pumps, valves, and temperature layers that she had begun treating wood as if all wood were the same. It was not. The pallet shop gave her cut-offs for free, but free did not mean dry. One January load had been stacked outside under a torn sheet of plastic. The pieces looked fine on top. The middle of the pile had been drinking rain for weeks. Lena loaded the boiler after supper and knew within 15 minutes that something was wrong. The fire struggled. The flue temperature climbed slowly. Smoke stayed visible at the stack. She had protected the boiler return. The draft was good, and the storage still had room to accept heat. Nothing in the water side explained the lazy burn. She split one of the thicker pieces and pressed a borrowed pin moisture meter into the fresh face. The number was high enough to settle the argument. A meaningful share of the fire's energy was being spent boiling water out of the wood before that energy could become useful heat. Worse, the cooler, dirtier burn was moving her back toward the same creosote conditions she had fought during the first failure. Lena shut the loading door and stared at the woodpile through the utility room window. She had been proud of not buying fuel. Now she understood that a free fuel source could still be expensive if it arrived in the wrong condition. The fix was not clever. She built a roof over the slabwood rack. She stacked pieces off the ground with space for air. She rotated older fuel forward instead of burying it behind fresh loads. She stopped accepting soaked waste wood merely because someone wanted it gone. Most of all, she stopped counting a truckload as useful energy until the wood was dry enough to burn cleanly. That changed the way she talked about the system. When people asked how much fuel it used, she no longer answered in truckloads. Truckloads were meaningless. Species, moisture, and actual dry weight mattered more than the size of the pile. The farm never became a laboratory, but Lena began weighing representative armloads on an old feed scale. She did not need perfect measurements. She needed comparisons honest enough to tell her when she was fooling herself. Two burns could look the same through the loading door and leave very different amounts of usable heat in storage. Dry fuel charged the tanks faster, kept the flue cleaner, and shortened the hours Lena had to stand near the boiler. Wet fuel made smoke, wasted time, and created maintenance. That was another limit nobody could remove with a bigger tank. The following cold spell taught her one more. For 3 days the temperature stayed below freezing and dropped into single digits each night. Wind worked every weakness in the farmhouse. The storage carried the night, but not the entire next day and night on one burn. Lena had to fire in the morning and again in the evening. On the second day, she left for a livestock sale 2 towns over and came home later than planned. The tank temperatures had fallen below her preferred range. The oil backup came on before she reached the driveway. She stood in the kitchen listening to the burner run and felt the old irritation rise. Then she looked at the notebook. The system had not failed. She had asked it to cover more hours than she had stored. That distinction mattered. Storage did not cancel the heat load. It only moved energy through time. If the weather stayed hard long enough, or if Lena skipped a charge, the account ran down. She could have added more tanks. There was room for one. She chose not to. More storage would have cost money, taken space, increased standby loss, and solved a problem that happened only a few days each winter. The oil burner already existed for exactly that kind of edge case. For once, Lena decided not to optimize the farm into a corner. She wrote a new line in the notebook. Backup is not defeat. Backup is capacity you do not have to build twice. That sentence changed Cal Stokes's opinion of the project more than the warm radiators did. He had expected Lena to become the kind of convert who had to prove one fuel source morally superior to another. Instead, she kept the oil system, maintained it, and simply reduced how often she needed it. The result was less dramatic than total independence. It was also more reliable. By spring, Lena had enough records to compare one winter with the previous one without pretending the weather had been identical. The exact numbers moved with cold spells, animal loads, and how much of the house was occupied. The pattern did not. Purchased heating fuel had fallen sharply. Wood handling had increased. Electricity use for circulation rose modestly. Maintenance time shifted from burner service and deliveries toward chimney cleaning, pump checks, and fuel handling. Money was not the only thing moving. Control was. Lena could choose to do the hard work in daylight. She could burn cleanly when she was present. She could inspect the system during a charge, instead of leaving a fire to smolder through the night. And when the farm was too busy, the backup could carry a few hours without turning one missed firing into an emergency. That balance was the first version Lena was willing to call successful. Marnie Holt understood it before most people did. Her greenhouse sat behind the feed store, a low structure where she started vegetable plants for half the county. Every spring, a late cold snap forced her to drag portable heaters between the benches and hope none of them quit before dawn. One February morning, she walked into the Mercer utility building, looked at the tank gauges, and asked a question with no joke attached. How small can this get? Lena did not answer immediately. Depends what you're trying to keep warm. Not warm. Alive. Tomatoes, peppers, a few thousand seedlings. 3 nights in March, maybe 5. You have a heat source? Old wood boiler. Good one. Too much boiler for that greenhouse, honestly. Space for a tank? I have a dead 400-gallon milk cooler behind the feed store. Lena smiled despite herself. Marnie pointed at her. Don't make that face. What face? The face where you remember I laughed first. Lena picked up a tape measure. Show me the tank. Marnie's greenhouse system was not a copy of Lena's. It did not need 6 tanks. It did not need a barn loop. It did not need to carry a farmhouse through a winter night. It needed to catch enough heat from one clean evening burn to keep a greenhouse above the danger line until sunrise. Lena used one old dairy tank, a simple heat exchange loop, properly protected boiler return, and a low-temperature delivery loop sized for the greenhouse. The first version worked badly. That mattered. The greenhouse loop moved too much water too quickly and destroyed the useful temperature difference. The tank became uniformly lukewarm before midnight. Lena throttled the flow, changed the control point, and let the storage stratify. On the next cold night, the top layer stayed useful long enough to protect the crop. Marnie lost no seedlings. She also learned that thermal storage is not automatically efficient simply because the tank is large. After that, word traveled, not as a miracle, as a question. Could one tank help a poultry brooder through the night? Could 2 tanks take the peaks off a wood-fired shop heater? Could a church basement use stored heat from a daytime burn and coast through evening meetings without leaving a fire unattended? Sometimes Lena said yes. Sometimes she said no. A house with no insulation did not need more tankage first. A farmer without a cheap fuel source was not going to save money by building a complicated wood system. A building with no room for safe storage was a poor candidate. A person unwilling to clean a boiler had no business pretending maintenance would happen because a new idea sounded clever. Those refusals gave Lena more credibility than the successes. Cal Stokes noticed the shift before she did. One morning, he pulled into the yard with a service truck, not the sales sedan. Lena was replacing a pump bearing on the greenhouse loop Marnie had brought over for repair. Cal came into the utility room carrying a cardboard box. "I brought you something." Inside was a three-way mixing valve, new. Lena looked up. "Why?" "Customer ordered it, changed systems, can't return it." "You don't give away parts." "I don't. So what do you want?" Cal leaned against the doorway. "I got a man with a cabinet shop. He runs a wood boiler all day and dumps heat out the roof after 5 because nobody wants to tend it at night. He heard about your tanks." Lena waited. "I can do the controls," Cal said. "I can do the listed boiler. I can do the permit. I don't know how you're sizing storage." There it was. Not an apology. Something more useful. A real question. Lena pulled her notebook closer. "What's his load?" Cal took a folded sheet from his pocket. They worked at the bench for an hour. The cabinet shop job became the first system Lena touched where somebody else handled most of the installation. That changed the scale of the idea and exposed a new problem. Lena's own farm system worked partly because she was always there. She heard changes in pump noise. She noticed when a gauge drifted. She knew which valve had a stiff stem and which pipe clicked when it expanded. A system installed for another owner could not depend on Lena's ears, so the documentation got better. Control labels, normal temperature ranges, shutdown instructions, cleaning intervals, a simple diagram showing where the heat went during charge, during discharge, and during a power failure. Mel Turner reviewed the cabinet shop plan and made the same point he had made after the ice storm. If a safe condition depends on somebody remembering what you meant, it isn't a safe condition yet. Lena wrote that on the inside cover of her notebook. By the third winter, the Mercer system looked less homemade than it had at the beginning. The tanks were still old dairy equipment. One still carried the shallow tractor dent from the auction, but the piping was labeled. The relief discharge was visible. The gravity dump zone had a clear path. The electrical panel had proper covers. The storage room stayed cool because heat was remaining where it belonged. The most satisfying proof was not a gauge. It was the fuel account. The Mercers had not eliminated all purchased energy. They still used electricity. They still kept oil as backup. In an extended absence or equipment failure, the old system could carry the buildings. But heating oil deliveries dropped from several winter fills to occasional backup use. The money that used to leave the farm in January began doing other jobs. A replacement kidding pen, a used mower conditioner, roof metal on the south side of the barn. Nothing dramatic enough for a newspaper. Exactly the kind of things that keep a small farm from becoming a former farm. Ray noticed that part. One afternoon he sat at the kitchen table opening mail while Lena came in with muddy boots. He held up the oil statement. "Know what this is?" "A bill." "No. Looks like a bill. It's a small bill. I had forgotten they made those." Lena hung her coat by the stove. "Don't get sentimental." "Wasn't planning to." He put the statement down beside the coffee pot. "You keeping the tanks?" Lena looked through the window at the utility building. "Probably." "Good. They look terrible." That was the closest thing to praise she wanted. The old auction tags disappeared from 5 of the tanks as insulation and piping changed. One survived. Lena had pulled it off before wrapping the largest vessel and tossed it on the workbench. Months later, she found it under a box of fittings. The red card was oil-stained at one corner. The string had gone stiff. No War cooling system failed. Scrap value only. She nailed it to the wall above the temperature gauges. Not as a joke, as a classification error. The tank had failed as a milk cooler. That statement was completely true. The mistake had been assuming that failure in one job erased usefulness in every other one. Over the next several years, Lena helped build a small number of storage systems across the Ridge country. Small number was the right number. The method had boundaries. It worked best where people already had a safe wood-fired hydronic heat source, cheap or waste biomass, enough room for insulated storage, and a reason to separate the time of burning from the time of using heat. It was not a replacement for every furnace. It was not free heat. It was not a machine that turned scrap into money without labor. And it did not excuse bad building envelopes, unsafe boilers, or lazy maintenance. Those limitations did not weaken the idea. They made it usable. The cabinet shop ran its boiler hard during working hours and used stored heat after the last employee went home. Marnie's greenhouse stopped depending on portable heaters for every late frost. A poultry farm used storage to smooth the night load in one brooder building, then abandoned the expansion plan when the owner realized he did not want the extra wood handling. Lena counted that as a successful decision, too. The goal was never to spread tanks everywhere. The goal was to stop confusing one purchased solution with the only possible solution. Cal eventually became better at explaining that than Lena was. Years after the first kitchen table estimate, he stood with a farm couple in the Mercer utility room and pointed at the gauge stack. "This system doesn't make the boiler stronger," he told them. "It makes the boiler's good hours useful later." Lena was on the other side of the room, replacing insulation around a valve. She heard him and said nothing. Cal glanced over. What? Nothing. You made that face." "What face?" "The one where you remember I called this a plumbing problem." Lena tightened the insulation jacket. "It is a plumbing problem." Cal laughed. "Fair enough. By then, nobody needed a villain anymore. The argument had matured. The useful question was not whether oil heat was bad, or wood heat was noble, or old equipment was better than new equipment. The useful question was whether a farm had any control over when it had to spend money, labor, and fuel. Storage created some of that control. On the Mercer place, control was the difference between loading a boiler at 7 in the evening and feeding a fire at 2 in the morning. It was the difference between using slab wood when Lena had time to handle it and calling a fuel company because the weather had chosen the schedule. It was the difference between a system that stopped when electricity failed and one that failed safely enough to wait for the lights to return. The tanks themselves were almost embarrassingly ordinary by then. They held water. That was all. The intelligence was in what Lena had learned around them. Protect the fire from cold return. Protect the system from power loss. Protect stored heat from useless loss. Preserve temperature layering instead of stirring it away. Fix the building before blaming the heater. Keep a backup because independence is not the same thing as pretending nothing can fail. Each lesson had arrived attached to a mistake. Lena never hid that part when people asked for her notes. The first page she showed them was not the page with the cold night success. It was the page from the first smoky firing, blackened at the corner where she had written in block letters, "Cold return, dirty fire, wrong." The second was the ice storm page, power out, pump out, fire, still live. Then the corrected diagram, not because failure made a better story, because a person copying only the success could repeat the dangerous part without understanding why it had changed. That was the piece Lena took most seriously. People liked to say she had built a heat battery out of junk. She usually corrected them. "The tanks are cheap," she would say. "The safe parts aren't. There were controls worth buying new. Relief devices that did not get reused. Pipe sizes that could not be guessed, clearances that did not shrink because money was short, chimneys that had to draft correctly, water treatment that had to be checked, wood that had to be dry. A system that saved money by deleting safety was not clever. It was just unpaid damage waiting for a date. That sentence made Lena unpopular with the kind of men who liked building everything from scrap merely to prove they could. She was comfortable with that. Her own project had started with scrap, but it survived because she learned where scrap stopped being the right answer. Ray Mercer lived long enough to see the system become boring. That may have pleased him more than any other result. By the time his walking cane became permanent and his trips to the barn became short inspections instead of workdays, he no longer asked whether Lena had fired the boiler. He asked whether the tanks were charged. The language had changed inside the family before Lena noticed it. One winter morning, a delivery driver pulled into the yard by mistake. He had the right road and the wrong Mercer. Ray met him on the porch. The driver looked at the old fill pipe beside the house and then at his ticket. "You need oil?" Ray shook his head. "Not today. You want me to top it off while I'm here?" Ray looked toward the utility building. A thin line of clean smoke was rising from the wood boiler stack. The house windows were clear. Frost still covered the north side of the roof. "No," he said. "We're ahead." That was all. No explanation. The truck backed out and went down the road. Years later, after Ray was gone and the farm had fewer goats, the storage system was still there. Lena replaced pumps. She changed controls. One of the original tanks developed a seep at an old fitting and was isolated until she could repair the connection. The boiler was eventually replaced with a newer listed unit that burned cleaner and required less tending. The tanks remained. Their original refrigeration hardware had been useless for decades. Their second life had outlasted the job they were built for. The red auction tag stayed on the wall. In winter, visitors still noticed it before they understood what they were looking at. They saw stainless tanks, insulated pipe, gauges, a boiler, and a handwritten log clipped to a board. The system no longer looked impossible. That was the quietest proof of all. An idea becomes ordinary after enough people learn which parts are difficult. On a January night more than 20 years after the dairy auction, Lena finished an evening burn and walked the utility room the way she always had. Flue clean, boiler settling, storage hot at the top, cooler at the bottom, gravity safety path open, house loop calling gently, outside. Wind moved through the bare oaks along the ridge. Inside the farmhouse, the radiators were warm. Lena reached up and touched the old red tag above the gauges with one finger. Cooling system failed. Scrap value only. She left the light on long enough to write one final temperature in the log, then switched it off and closed the utility room door. Nothing else started.